an organization that has diverse mindset will probably move slower and have more arguments, but it's less likely to move in the wrong direction. We've embraced hiring apprentices, which has been a great way to get people from very diverse backgrounds in. We were not the laser-focused career candidates who had a burning vocation to work at your company and your industry. We basically applied to everybody that came to Oxford. And the programming languages they taught you at school are certainly dead and out of date now.
So, Julian, I would love to know from you, what do you think is the leading challenge in hiring great data talent at the moment?
I'd say the biggest challenge actually is it's related to diversity, but not in the very traditional sense of the phrase. But it's about getting in diversity of mindset, and that tends to come from diversity of experience, which is you get people in from, if they've all come from the same kind of path, if they've all taken the same kind of educational path within your country of usually the same sort of courses at school and the same sort of universities. Certainly within the UK, you get a small subset of universities. They tend to think about problems in very similar ways. So you might, on traditional aspects, have a very diverse intake, whether it's on gender, sexuality, ethnic background, or similar. But they've been taught to solve problems the same way, and that will probably introduce the great danger for a data team is that introduces biases and groupthink. An organization that has diverse mindset will probably move slower and have more arguments, but it's less likely to move in the wrong direction. And I think that's especially important in data where you might end up measuring the wrong things, setting the wrong KPIs, jumping to the wrong conclusions. And doubly so when if you're starting to build AI-driven processes, you might be picking up biases in the way they operate that you haven't even noticed.
So do you feel like our definitions of diversity have been a little bit limited?
No, I think it's expanding and building on them. So things like some companies and recruiters already kind of try and look for people who've taken different backgrounds. Some HR teams talk about squiggly careers where you've moved different ways. We've embraced hiring apprentices, which has been a great way to get people from very diverse backgrounds in. So we've seen with apprenticeship recruitment, people who are shifting career, people who are coming back into the workforce after having had a child, people who maybe come through, who've been studying in their own time in parallel with a job in a completely different industry. Equally, kind of looking for people who maybe, when doing graduate recruitment, keeping an eye out for folks who may be like the first from their family to go to university, or in the UK they've been to the Open University. Often gets you certainly interesting people. They're always worth a conversation. You've got more chance that you get someone that's not a good fit, but equally you may well, if you find someone that meets the criteria for what you're looking for in terms of skills and propensity to learn, that could be a great asset to the team just because they'll think about problems in a different way.
Okay, so it's about really having extra dimensions about a candidate beyond the more traditional ones. Is that then something that you've consciously collected as part of the hiring process?
Yeah, and some of it by opening up different streams in for your different points in which people might enter the workforce. So you've got a lot of companies have the very traditional path of I'll take placement students for an internship, and then I'll bring them in as graduates when they finish their university degree, and that's great. And it's a really good way to get strong talent that you've built up a relationship with and taught a lot of your techniques before they even walk in the door as a full-time graduate employee. But I think there's a lot of value in saying, okay, we'll have a certain number of placement students. We'll look to fill our roles. A certain number we'll take, say, from an apprenticeship scheme is one side. We've seen some universities offering PhD. We tried it out with a PhD placement, for example, recently. So someone at the other end of the scale that's come from a more academic background. So bringing in some who are post-grad, effectively, path. And then others where you look to reskill people from within, lateral moves from within the existing organisation. And that last bit, I wouldn't underestimate either. Because they'll frequently bring domain knowledge that's more relevant to your particular job, but they might want to get into your field, into the data space. So you maybe bringing in someone from a customer success organisation or software organisation or a finance side into a data team to focus more on the data, simply based on those that have found that they have a knack for it, they have an interest in it. In the same way that one of my team that came in as an apprentice her background originally was in fashion, and she discovered that she was always the person doing the spreadsheet work and the building the reports, and that was the bit she enjoyed, and that persuaded her to look at a career shift into data. You'll find those in a lot of organisations. You find the person who maybe equally, you might find people that are doing heavy admin roles, so they're often the super user in it, or the person that gets called on to deal with the problems when it comes to your Salesforce instance of like, okay, how do I enter this and how do I enter that? And they know all the ins and outs of what field was cannibalized for this or that. And the leadership go to them for expert advice. They may actually be good candidates for a data team to say, actually, do you want to make that your full-time job, that kind of reporting and understanding the as is rather than the should be that you get if you read the documentation. By having a variety of channels, you're much more likely to get that breadth of experience, is my feeling.
Yeah, those shadow analytics roles are really interesting. And I wonder whether, with the development of AI, with let's say a ChatGPT, does that almost reduce the barrier to entry to some of these more technical things that someone with that domain expertise can really excel?
If you wanted to get into the Python space, actually the barrier to entry is a lot lower, because you just kind of start to need to know what you want to do and a couple of basic courses and be willing to embrace a ChatGPT like Copilot. You can do a lot of the basic tasks and quickly learn, how do I load a file? How do I move a data frame around? How do I join stuff together? All that you'll pick up very quickly now. Equally, slight plug incoming from Matillion products here. We built a Copilot into it that allows natural language interaction with on top of our low-code platform. And where we started to see that, especially with the Gen AI tools, have real power is being able to put them in the hands of someone who's a domain specialist, who's got a subject matter expert, rather than a specialist data engineer or data scientist. And they'll know much better what good data and bad data looks like, what good answers look like. They'll have at the top of their head what a ballpark figure ought to be coming out at the end of any pipeline, for example. So that barrier to entry is stuff that some businesses like ours are going after in terms of allowing folks who might be an analyst in a line of business unit to do more of their own data analysis and data engineering rather than being dependent on a central data team. But equally, those folks then become good candidates to move into a centralized data team if you want to make it more formal.
What about risks with that approach? So let's say we move into this new world where suddenly there's all these kind of almost like shadow analytics people who've now adopted AI and are starting to do more analytics themselves without necessarily knowing the details, maybe not being an expert in the underlying code or the data science.
That's where you still need a strong skeleton and a process that wants to embrace them rather than treat them as a slight. It's always a risk where you've got a shadow IT or shadow data organization to be slighted that they don't want to use the lovely dashboard your team has put together, and try and either shut them down or certainly not talk to them. It's much better to empower those people and say, okay, here's our public data catalog, here's the structure we want people to pull data from, here's our process for taking your one-time or your ad hoc pieces of reporting and then bringing that back into the centralized. Okay, you see it over and over again. Somebody puts together a spreadsheet analysis or a quick piece of analysis for one meeting. Their management like it. The meeting comes around again next month and they're asked to do it again. Suddenly a couple of people refer to it and okay, you've almost got a business as usual report now. So you give those people a channel to pass that back in, to publish it, have it validated and maintained, so that suddenly, effectively you're recruiting those folks to help you build official dashboards rather than something sitting on a spreadsheet and a shared drive that's not properly maintained and dangerously so.
Do you feel like we probably undervalue internal candidates relative to external ones, and there's a lot of untapped talent there?
I think that's a sad thing, that it's too easy to go off and post the job posting before you've even thought about could you arrange a lateral move. I think it's very healthy to always do succession planning within an organization, to say, okay, if I need to add more, if I need to replace one of my team, okay, who of the junior members of my team could step up to take on a more senior role, and who could I go and reach out to in a lateral organization that might be able to take over a task or be a candidate to bring in. They bring in valuable connections, they bring in valuable domain expertise. They already know the business. Okay, you may have to do more education on the formal processes of your org and good behavior, good data engineering, good best practice there. But that's no different to bringing in an external candidate who maybe has the perfect academic experience but needs to learn the business. Everybody's got some learning to do with any job.
Yeah, you get rid of the notice period as well. You save on recruitment fees.
And it's healthy it's good for people to see within it. It improves morale in both teams often, to see that successful moves like that, and to see that you can grow, and we're supporting our own employees' growth. Um, and even and don't be afraid of people that the other organisation doesn't massively rate highly. In the past, some of my best hires have come from those whose then internal moves, whose own managers were like, "Yeah, fine, take that guy," kind of. That because and you get them into a new team, you try to give them a slightly different job, you give them a bit of love and attention and support for what they really want to do, and you maybe find a strength that they didn't know they had, or they've got rid of stuff they were struggling with, and actually they got a chance to establish themselves fresh, and those folks then become your most productive and most loyal members of the team. Obviously, you got to find some way of assessing, do you think they have the potential to do the job? But it's the fact that somebody's trundling along, not doing very much and not going anywhere in one org, doesn't necessarily mean they won't flourish when you move them into something different.
Yeah, I wonder why larger companies don't do this better. Is it just the complexity of having tens of thousands of people across all these different departments? Maybe not data available on each person's skill, for example?
And some people there's a fear of doing succession planning. And when you're doing succession planning, you ought to be looking at like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not about to sack that guy or anything like that. I don't think he's going to. But he might get, or she might get the perfect opportunity come up, or something happens family wise or illness wise or whatever, and then they move on. People move on, and then you execute the plan, and then you reach out to the people you thought about that might be interested. And equally, there's a fear of, I think one of the biggest frictions is there's a fear of having the conversation and expressing an interest in a rotation as being seen as disloyal to your current boss and your current org, and that might be damaging to your chance of promotion. And that's probably the biggest thing to solve. And I don't have a magic wand for that one. But if nothing else, when you talk to if you talk to your own direct reports about their ambitions and they express interest that might be better served in adjacent teams, it's worth having a conversation with the leader, your peer managers, to say, hey, I think this person might have a spot in your team, or that might be their next step, might be there, rather than going up the chain in mine. Especially if I haven't got a spot they can grow into unless somebody leaves.
Yeah, that would be the mature response. I guess some managers might not think of that as holistically as you do.
There's also the fear of that. Okay, I'm losing experience resource. I'm gonna I've got to then backfill them. But if you're mature about it, you ought to say, well, okay, that's then an opportunity for a junior member of the team to grow into that role, to shuffle the work around a little bit, give everybody something fresh, give them a chance to learn something new and stretch. I'm sure many people's steps up in careers equally have come from, okay, your boss or the tech lead in a particular area has left or has gone for whatever reason, and you're asked to cover something that's a stretch for you. And actually, that's often quite healthy, because sometimes you get stuck in, okay, I'm doing repetitive stuff, I know how to do it, but I'm not really stretching myself. And then I get a bit bored, and then I start to get sort of silent about my job, despite the fact that actually, if I'd had something new for a while with a little bit of air cover for, like, give this person a break for 3 months, they just stepped into the role, expect a few mistakes. It can be really healthy for them, and then they end up both leveling up their skills and feeling happier about where they're at.
Yeah, I mean, God, we all have so much extra to contribute, don't we? I mean, how many of us are operating at our full maximum capacity all the time? There's a lot of untapped potential there.
Some of it could be just boredom as well, or you get to the same problem, facing the same problems month after month, year after year. I remember a long while back in my career, somebody ringing me up to ask about some missing data, marketing lead stuff, and being a bit grumpy on the call and putting the phone down, thinking it's totally unfair to be grumpy with that person. Their inquiry is 100% reasonable. It's just I've been in the same spot for several years, and I'm getting tired of chasing down missing marketing leads. There's time to look for something new. Time to make an internal move.
Yeah, 100%. Last time we were chatting, you were telling me about some recruitment use cases of the product and what you guys are working on.
Some of the stuff we're starting to think about experiment with generative AI. Yeah, so that's obviously these sort of tools have to be used very, very carefully in this space. But we think that there are some opportunities to explore, and at the moment it's just experiments to see how well they score compared to what an experienced recruiter would do. What we found is that obviously most people think of the chat interface, we think of a chatbot. What we've done within the Matillion product is baking the calls to these models into a data pipeline. So you might have, if you imagine I've got a dozen CVs coming in, I could put them through into a transactional data pipeline, and you put in calls to ask questions about each one. So you could use Occupier to ask for a summary of that CV, for example, or but you could also start to ask questions like, do they have any evidence of a particular skill? And in this kind of process, asking questions that we ask for a yes/no judgment are very powerful. So, for example, you could raise these things and say, does this CV show any experience in Python? Or does this CV show more than the most basic experience in Python? Answer yes or no only. And our experiment that we're working on here is to work out, okay, what's the kind of list of questions you might have in your head as a recruiter when you're going through reviewing a stack of CVs, and we've all been there. You might have dozens, even hundreds to go through. Can I get a very dry, unambiguous list of questions to go through and review those CVs? Because you might very well do. We used to do it in terms of like how many points have they got on A level in terms of score? The scores based on grades. Have they got this particular grade? Have they been to what's the quality of the educational establishment? Is it on a sort of certain list of top tier universities or not? Do they look alternatively? Do they look like they've come from an unusual background of the open university, or someone who's come through, had some work experience prior to coming to an intern role? All things that can be turned into yes or no flags. That then becomes very unemotional. It's not, there's far less of a kind of like, oh, I've read the whole CV and made a judgment that you look like the sort of person that I am, or the person that built the Gen AI. But instead, it's very big an audit trail to say, okay, I've got my flags to say location shows they're within a certain distance of the office. They've got education to the level that we're looking for. They've got experience of this particular role. They've got they've got experience of QA processes or data visualization or whatever criteria. And they're all yes, no stuff. It's very auditable. And then you can kind of filter things based on that score, or maybe you do you must have so many ticks across the board to go through to the next level of screening. Our first experiments with this involve looking at it for kind of recruiter sanity checking themselves, going through the pile of CVs that actually just been reviewed and seeing if the model comes out with roughly the same set of people as the human did. And then maybe when we've done that a few times, we might have some confidence to look at it elsewhere. But at the moment, we're taking it very gently. We want a lot of human review. But that kind of pre-screening of like, okay, I've flagged up the ones that are meeting so many criteria. The other interesting one we're exploring, and one of our customers is exploring, is actually then using that to generate an automated email back to the candidate before you make a judgment, yes or no. Just say something like, we've read your resume. We see evidence of these things, which is great. We can't see anything in the resume that's of evidence of X, Y, Z, whatever the other criteria were. Do you have any additional experience you want to highlight, or are you interested in taking training in those sort of things? Give them a chance to respond to that, which you wouldn't have time to do as a normal human. But if you automate that process, it gives them a chance to push something back in and build a response. And that's, again, early days. It opens up the possibility of a very different mode of recruitment, which is, I can see recruitment agencies or large HR departments have a lot of roles saying to those that are unsuccessful candidate, are you happy to give us permission to keep your CV on file and keep screening you against any new roles that come up? Because rescreening becomes a much lower intensity task at that point, and you might then get flagged up with it. Okay, sorry you didn't make this one, but we found these 3 other roles that you might be a fit for within our system. Maybe that becomes more of a equally. I could see that pushing it to be able to say, yeah, feel free to give us a longer resume, give us 3 or 4 pages if you want.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we're really going to have to rethink a lot of things, then you're right, because suddenly exactly all the rules of thumb, I'll make it 1 or 2 pages, has to be concise. It has to be concise for a human to read it. If an AI is reading it, doesn't matter if it's 1 or a million pages. I'm sure there's some limit at the moment, but within reason. And so that is really cool. One, I think, really difficult challenge with this on the first use case is, and so we've done some interesting analysis here, is around like, what are we optimizing for? Because if the data set is a recruiter who's selected CVs, if that starting point is so biased, subjective, and random, we wouldn't want to build something to replicate that. We have an opportunity to do something almost better.
The alternative is you could start even using the model to generate the question list based on the job posting. It certainly could challenge people thinking to say, okay, I'll feed in the job posting, generate me 10 or 20 questions that you would have in mind when evaluating CVs for that role. That can probably start to challenge biases a little bit. I think the other question then is you might use that kind of process and then say, okay, well, let's have a look at the ones that the recruiter rejected and the model picked out, especially. But there's learning to be had in the gaps between the human and the machine there. Which ones did the model choose that the human said no to? Which ones did the model say no to that the human said yes to? And that'll probably give us some really rich data about how the process that we built biases into it. As the person got biases that you need to work on, and then that's the sort of process we need to go through before we start to use this in any kind of real life process rather than just an experiment.
It's reminded me of an experiment we did ourselves a few years ago, which is probably worth a quick chat about. And we basically got a set of around 500 CVs. We shared them with 10 different recruiters independently, so they didn't really know each other was involved in this. We gave them a job description, and we said, shortlist of CVs based on this job description. And behind the scenes, we also had those candidates' test scores, like skills-based assessments, that we didn't share with any of the recruiters. And what was fascinating, to cut a long story short, was the recruiters came back and they almost all had different recommendations. And there was, I think, only one candidate that more than 3 of them selected. So it was almost like flipping a coin. Like, the level of randomness was quite staggering, despite the fact on paper they had the same data sets to choose from. But it's just like they probably each approached it in a different way. Maybe some spent 10 seconds, some spent a minute. Some came with their own biases. Some took the kind of subjective criteria of a GD and a CV and kind of filled in their own gaps. And I think that's going to make it so difficult to create any tool to kind of optimize CVs based on what recruiters have already selected or thought.
The only approach I could see there is a sort of scaling wisdom of crowds thing, which is you could build a process that's like, how well does this match this person's set of criteria and the way they do it, and then duplicate that across a bunch of experienced recruiters. And effectively, what you're doing is you're doing the equivalent of repeating that exercise with 8 to 10 people for every single CV that comes in, and say, okay, 4 out of the 7 models rated this person. How do we respond to that? It's certainly, again, be an interesting experiment. It's that ability to scale. I don't know whether having a bunch of people, all of whom have slightly different approaches and biases together, and does that generate wisdom of crowds, or is that just reinforcing what's accepted or what's normal?
I feel like the other challenge is going to be ultimately, so we can select CVs perhaps with AI. I think we can at least get rid of the manual effort from a human. Amazing. Speed up the process. Amazing. Give feedback straight to the candidate. Go through that iterative process. Like, that's all already a staggering improvement on the current situation. But still, I feel like the CV itself is the problem, in the sense that it's a pretty crap data set to decide who to interview, because it's someone's written something about themselves. And I wonder if you can envision any other way it's going to be done. Like, is there going to be some other data set we're going to use to make those decisions?
It's an artificial construct because we're asking people to summarize down how they present themselves for purely for the constraint of one person reading it, because one person can't scale it. I could ask someone to give me their PhD thesis and summaries and the 5 LinkedIn articles they've written and their whole podcast series or similar, And I can't read all of that. I haven't got time. No. But maybe there's room there for saying, actually, you can submit plenty of supporting evidence here. Send me your references. Send me the things. Send me your GitHub links to your GitHub repo. Send me the article you wrote for the college magazine as an undergraduate. Whatever other bits of evidence you've got, and we can put all that into the pot, summarize it up, and say, okay, what's this tell us about you? That might be again an area to explore. I give you much more opportunity. You can send me a video if you like. We can process that too. That's all self-selected information, of course. I think the getting stuff that's aside from that then becomes a question of like, what you're allowed to share, what's reasonable, what's fair. Are you too vulnerable to the unfair opinions of others around you?
Yeah, it's fascinating. You're right. The fact that suddenly we aren't limited by the 5 seconds a human has to look at X.
That's one of the greatest powers that the Gen AI stuff brings to data processing is it can easily synthesize data from multiple unstructured and varied formats. You can send in a PowerPoint, you can send a CV in and a PDF, you can send me a spreadsheet, you can send me a massive long chat history, or you can send me a video that I can transcribe, all of which are equally, it can synthesize and then say, okay, can I see evidence of X, Y, Z? And maybe that I can see it becoming a bit more of adds more value to showcase projects, to say the GitHub repo stuff, the previous case studies and that sort of thing. And that might be something that education institutions need to improve on in terms of giving people, as part of your course, you start to produce some coursework that becomes a matter of almost public record, or at least gives the student something for their portfolio that they can show future prospective employers.
It could get to like content-driven recruitment almost, where the candidate really needs to be out there producing something in some format publicly available that showcases them and their abilities. That's interesting.
But it doesn't necessarily, hopefully, it doesn't necessarily have to be tailored to every single interview. It's more like a professional creative building up a portfolio of things to show.
Awesome, cool. I'm excited thinking about that now. What about thinking? What about thinking a little bit now about fairness and transparency? So we've just laid out a whole set of ways that the current incumbent process is actually quite opaque and unfair. So I feel like hopefully we can improve that with AI, but do you see some challenges or some ways that it could somehow become less fair or less transparent?
Yeah, if you've not got visibility to the criteria by which any judgment calls being made, so that kind of list of evaluation criteria, for example, there's certainly it's certainly one thing about understanding what's intended by an advertisement and how the recruiters are going to score it is always been a challenge. I think it might doubly become so. This was stuff, ironically, this stuff I saw where we dug into and were able to have a really big impact on gender balance in recruitment. Just because by getting to what eventually an analysis that led us to an understanding of differences by the way male and female candidates tended to read advertisement and expect to be scored and expected to be judged. This was back with Web Cisco. We looked at the kind of woeful ratio we had of male-female recruitment. And this is where I'd advise people to take a data-driven approach to anything when you're looking at trying to improve this balance. And what we saw was that while we hired a very small proportion of female software engineers, and that was something a problem we wanted to fix. If you work through the process by all statistical measures was totally fair, because every step, the percentage converting all the way from CV to inviting to first screen through to assessment center to an offer being made and acceptance of the offer, not a whisker in it in the percentages going through. The problem was only 10% of the applications were from female candidates. So it showed us we needed to change the way we handle what we do to get more women candidates in. And what we found with a bunch of interviews there was that female candidates were more prone to take a job posting that had a whole long list of skills required and discount themselves for lacking a small proportion of that. Whereas male candidates were far more willing to chance their arm and say, okay, I know about a quarter of these well, I know another quarter a little bit, and I'll blag the others or I'll learn them as I go. Um, and the female candidates were saying, well, I'm missing one quarter of the requirements and I'll exclude myself. And so we simply changed the wording of the adverts based on this. And we said these roles will involve these like 8 to 10 skills as part of their day-to-day business. If you've got prior experience of some, that is great, but we are looking for people who are willing to learn these as part of this. This is an early in career roles. People who are willing to learn these as part of this job. At a stroke, that took us from 10% female applications to 40%. And across the board, it also got, looking at the kind of academic grades, got us brighter candidates of both genders or all genders, because we were emphasising the learning part of the role, and that got us the brighter candidates as well as a far more diverse selection. Ultimately, out of that, we took majority female software engineers that year and subsequent years. And it obviously, apart from the initial research, it didn't cost anything. This is very replicable. That's why I was keen to share this story. It's like you can do this today. And just when you're looking at writing a role, there's a lot that can be done to make it more appealing to different groups. And I'm sure if you looked at other axes of diversity you want to address, the same analysis could probably bear fruit. What appeals to you, what doesn't, if you're neurodiverse, depending on educational background or similar. But certainly we did well by emphasising, okay, here's where we want to get you to 6 months into the role or a year into the role. You don't have to have all this walking in the door. It works really well and shows people where they can grow into, and it gets you people with the more driven candidates, the more learning focused candidates. So I'd share that lesson to anybody in tech in any form to look at your job adverts hard.
That's such a great example. I love that. And it made me think of a couple of things. So one is, that analysis to you was probably a no-brainer. That was almost probably an automated response of how you would approach to solve that problem. I heard a similar anecdote from someone yesterday who's like a marketing analyst, and the company they're working for had recently had a big VC investment, and they said to them, okay, we need to hire like 300 people like this in, I don't know, some ridiculously short period of time. And so that basically made it such that they had to take some kind of analytical approach to it, because they had to really think about the funnel. He used all his knowledge of a marketing funnel, which is the recruitment funnel is the exact same thing, and naturally started to think about those conversion rates. I wonder whether, though, that mindset, those skill sets are just quite lacking in talent and HR in general, because not a lot of people come from science or data or engineering backgrounds to those fields. And so they just wouldn't think like that. That's not their automated way to approach the problem. What do you think?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I don't want to slight my peers in those organisations, but that was very much the way of driving it. And again, this in some ways comes back to our earlier point about bringing in folks from adjacent teams. That you bring a different mindset and a different approach to the problem, and sometimes that's the solution you need. I'm sure there are many things that those data skills are not relevant to in a talent space, but in that use case, it was the silver bullet. What was interesting about it though was that the analysis of moving through the steps was trivial, as you say. It literally was work of maybe an hour. What was much harder was finding ways to collect data on why weren't people applying. How do you find who to interview? How do you assemble that data? And that we had to, we surveyed a bunch of folks. We talked to people, particularly we even talked to some of the knew the latest interns and the latest graduates about what were they most reluctant to apply, and what made them most nervous. That gave us a lot of valuable insight. And then we tried it with a few students at the open days, that sort of thing. You do university open day type stuff. So you had to get creative with how you could find ways of collecting that data, and that probably comes back more into the traditional recruiter space about, okay, well, where am I got touch points to collect it?
Right, because of course, if they haven't applied, then you don't have their application. So that's
but it's you could probably get that more also from marketing, like the collect data on why the person didn't buy your product is always an interesting challenge. It's not.
And were these people who specifically you somehow knew had seen the Cisco job ads and had not applied, or was it just a set of people from university, or as a general survey into why they would or wouldn't apply?
And particularly, but also the low-hanging fruit was we interviewed a lot of women that were already at the company and asked their reaction to the adverts. We asked the people who had applied despite, and asked them, what was appealing versus what was off-putting about this. And actually, even the ones who had applied said, I had felt a bit nervous about not having all these things. So that was our big clue, and then we kind of validated that with the students. Again, the real proof was in the next round of recruitment where it came true.
Yeah, amazing. I think that's just such a great example because I've always had the perception, like working in the HR tech talent space for 5 years now, is that tech and data is seen as sort of anti-human, dehumanizing, etc. Yet this is a perfect example of where the analytics has helped you solve the diversity and equity problem. It's not been the cause of, it's been the solution to.
But it's made it unemotional, and it's cut the theories out and then brought us back down to, okay, what's the real? There was one other lesson we got following that process, almost by accident, not by no data at all, but by complete accident, which was we had a panel interview set up for some candidates that were due to come in. They were all scheduled to travel. The woman IT manager that was on the panel fell sick that morning with very short notice. A lot of the candidates had travelled overnight or similar for these interviews, so we couldn't really cancel them. And it really was a bit of a struggle last minute to find a female member of staff that was in the office available on that morning and could attend. And we actually ended up bringing one of the, so as junior as you can get, we brought one of the female interns in. Bear in mind, this was an intern's job piece. But the quick lesson it taught us was that when you're seeking to make up a diverse panel, they don't all necessarily need to be hiring managers. Actually, people who might be peers or even juniors to the role coming in will give you a different perspective. There was an example there where we were looking at one candidate, and the candidate in the interview had been talking about their gap year experiences doing charitable work in Africa. And the lesson we learned with this, obviously, get the junior person to give their feedback first, so they're not biased or feel like they're correcting anybody. But she called out that this candidate, sounds wonderful, but was talking about how they had a lovely trip to Africa funded by this charitable organisation, and not really anything about what they'd achieved or how they'd helped anyone or what use that had been to anybody that wasn't them. And the rest of us on the panel went, "Oh yeah, very specific. Yeah, we hadn't noticed that, but yes." It was like having somebody from that age group was quite helpful as well in terms of spotting behaviours that you wouldn't necessarily have been as sharp or aware to. So sometimes actually age in your hiring panel could be another diversity factor. And like I say, don't assume everybody's got to be an interviewing grizzled veteran or people leader.
Yeah, that's great. When I have seen a wider pool of people be interviewers, for example, in let's say a long hiring process where there might be numerous rounds, there's a wider variety of opinions, but that sometimes comes at the cost of different people having their own view over what the candidate should be or what skills they should have. And I find it sometimes dangerous if you're not sort of laser focused on the same page of what the criteria is. Anyone could come along and say, "Oh yeah, they were great, but I didn't like the communication skills for XYZ," and sort of add their own criteria, kind of shift the goalposts a bit.
I've seen things in the past where you look at exercises where some of the steps that creates is it gives opportunity for candidates to fall out of the process. It doesn't give an opportunity to shine. Particularly group exercises tend to be that way. Some of this might be, again, coming back to addressing biases, it might be time to take a long, hard look at, is the skill you're testing for actually relevant to the role? That kind of thing, like the whole kind of, if I'm hiring for a heads down data analyst who needs to occasionally present their results, but really I need them to be really good at the detail, really wise to any logical traps, and it's probably going to be working remote somewhere peaceful and quiet, and if they're going to share their reports with folks, needs a good written communication style. But do they need to be a wonderful, outgoing, gregarious person that functions really well in a noisy group environment? Maybe not. I think that's another bias that comes in from, again, both tech and HR can bring different biases. That I can see the HR side recruiters finding the outgoing and high soft skill personas very appealing. Equally, I can see the technical side I've seen technical sides over rotate on existing proven skills already over all round capability and willingness to learn. it's very, one of the flaws I see on the technical side is like, okay, well, this person has done X, Y, Z, so we've got proven knowledge of that. Great, but does that prove their ability to learn the next new technology that comes along? That's that you can over rotate on the very deep technical skills or on the soft side and personality side. And maybe part of the discussion is, okay, let's be really focused on what skills this role really needs. That I think that is also relevant to attracting neurodiverse talent. That some of the things that can exclude a neurodiverse candidate, again, particularly in the noisy, chaotic environment, team building side things, can be off-putting to someone who might actually, be on the spectrum somewhere, but be perfectly well skilled, or in fact really able in all of the things that role needs.
I don't want to sound like I'm having a go at HR again, but I would say that the challenge is, so let's say you've got like a combination of soft skills and technical skills you're after in a role. To be fair to talent and HR, they're not really in a position to evaluate the technical skills in an interview because it's not their job. So they just focus on the other side because they can't see the other 50%. Whereas at least in theory, a hiring manager should be able to evaluate both. Maybe a more junior technical person is, as you say, too laser focused on the technical bit.
You say, okay, you're scoring that bit. You don't necessarily. We're not interested in your opinion on their skills in that area because you're not that judge. I think that's the flaw for all of us, and why you need to have the discussion, because it's too easy for people to put their own biases on the job description or what they're recruiting for. I saw that incredibly early in my career when I was first applying for graduate roles. I and my friend, one of my friends, were both studying chemistry. And we both came to the conclusion where actually we didn't want to be bench chemists. They came out of the lab with headaches from all the solvents each day, and we were like, okay, well, what other jobs can we do? We applied a whole bunch of stuff. We were not the laser focused career candidates who had a burning vocation to work at your company and your industry. We basically applied to everybody that came to Oxford, and one of them was Procter and Gamble, and they had this lovely job advert that was talking about technical brand management. And it sounded like, obviously, I think the marketing team had got their hands on it and really played up the softer skills side. You need to have technical knowledge, but you'll be presenting and in a business context and all this sort of stuff. And both my friend and I, Paul and I, applied, and we got into the interviews, and we had the exact same experience. They said, "Why do you want this job?" And we said, "Well," and I said, "Well, because it gives me a chance to apply what I've learned as a chemist, but without necessarily being in the lab all the time. Because I don't really want to be in the lab all the time." The interview went, well, this is a very lab-focused job, and we'd expect to spend 80% of the time in the lab. And we went, I guess I won't waste any more of your time then. And my friend Paul had the exact same experience. And basically, the soft skills have been so played up in the job description. The fact that the role involved 80% of the time actually in a laboratory have been completely obscure. So that's what happens when you let people, one member of the team with too much of a focus on one area.
And you touched on briefly before the concept of like not over-indexing on current skills, but thinking more about like what is this person going to grow into over the next couple of years. Could you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, if you talk in the software engineering field, everyone there will have worked through many different graphical design frameworks or programming languages. The programming languages they taught you at school are certainly dead and out of date now. You've moved through things, in the data space, you might have started with MATLAB and moved on to R and moved on to Python. Some languages and frameworks and tools are more resilient than others. You're probably fairly safe that your Excel skills are going to stay relevant and current. But new things come along all the time. And it's very hard to test for, but it's the people who will flourish are the ones that can equally quickly skill up on those new technologies, or those new languages or models or similar. The witness this with Gen AI, for example. Nobody really had Gen AI experience more than a couple of years ago that wasn't deeply in a narrowly focused natural language processing field. But now everybody's frantically trying to learn it. And that's really is just a kind of, what's your mindset? Do you enjoy learning? Do you enjoy trying out new stuff? Do you enjoy learning for yourself? Do you appreciate your kind of learning style, whether that's understanding somebody learns better in a classroom and a structure, or by saying that for some employees I've had say, take the next couple of weeks and just go and play around with that and get yourself up to speed on it and tell me what you feel, is how they learn. And also they find like that's ideal 2 weeks work for them. Like, okay, trying something new is good fun. Others struggle with that and want a formal course there because teach me and I'll learn. I want to learn the theory and have it solid before I start banging away on a keyboard.
I guess part of the challenge is, so let's say you're evaluating someone's current technical skills, like you can probably measure that reasonably easily, but measuring their propensity to learn new things or the rate at which they can learn is harder. How have you seen that done, or have you got any ideas there?
Well, you can test for problem solving skills and how they tackle a problem. That's one part, and that's very transferable. Um, and that seems to be a lot of that. I'm looking for how much they check the criteria of the problem and understand what's there and understand the scope of it. I don't have a great answer for a brand new piece beyond explaining a very complex problem and seeing how well they follow and pick up on the details there. I think just talking about looking for evidence of self-driven learning, looking for evidence of stuff they've explored beyond their existing job or course is always good. Um, Sometimes when I've been interviewing again the early in career folks, the new graduates, I ask them what some of their favourite courses were, or the favourite chunks of their course, and then to kind of drill into that and ask that, have you done any reading around the subject beyond that? Have you explored anything? Tell me about why you enjoy that piece. And I'm trying to look for evidence of that. Are they excited by that at all? Is there any passion or interest there? Um, so, free tip to anybody who watches this ever being interviewed by me in the future is if I ask you about areas you're passionate about, or what you enjoy, I'm going to expect to see some evidence that you've actually that's the bit you want to do more of, because it's really like show me there's something in what you've studied has excited you, and because that's going to drive you to study more.
I remember now, actually, we had a little hack on this in our software engineering hiring process. So we have a set of company values like anyone else does, and we tried to think about how could we set up the hiring process to somehow measure those. And our general thought process was that talk is very cheap. Anyone can kind of say anything in an interview. They can kind of come up with some nice stories to evidence that they present certain values. But ultimately, if they can do something to show that value, I feel like that's a lot more compelling. So for us, we also thought along the same lines, like, well, this is a startup. We're going to change direction so many times. You have to learn new tools and technologies, and you're just going to have to change a lot. And so what we did was give our software engineering candidates a short programming problem in R, because none of them know R. So we suddenly were measuring, like, were they going to tell us to piss off and go, why am I going to learn this stupid statistical language? So it's kind of like a mindset. Could they learn it reasonably quickly to solve a simple problem? How did they approach it? So we found that was very interesting. What do you think of that approach?
Cool. Yeah, I did see that. I did see something similar once before. This is again back when I was applying for every graduate job under the sun. Um, and one of the people we were talking, got part way through the process through was GCHQ here in the UK, the security services folks. And one of their tests involved it actually educated you on how certain codes worked as they work through. Here's how these simple ciphers work. Imagine you're putting in this like grid or this crossword puzzle like that. Now try and tell me what this message does. And now it gets more complex and more complex. You had to solve the problems you went through. And that's probably still one of the more fascinating aptitude tests I've ever run into. So that was certainly an interesting way of doing it. But that kind of like giving them something new to try and solve, or a tool they've not worked with before, is, I guess, by definition. And even if they struggle, you might see whether do they enjoy it, or do they really hate facing something new. I think that's probably the
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of almost like meta challenges you could set up in hiring up there, like little indicators along the way that kind of around the process to give you a clue.
values one I've found. Giving away all the secrets here, but the one that I was taught once by one of my mentors, as a people manager, that a really good question is to ask people to think of somebody they enjoyed working with as part of a team, whether it's a group exercise at school or at work or even a social thing, and tell us what you liked about that person, why you liked having that person on your team. And then to do the same about, what about someone you found really frustrating to work with, and why did you struggle to work with that person? And those two questions together tell you so much about what that person values and what drives them up the wall. There's not necessarily any right or wrong answers, but it's a really good test to see um, um, equally asking them what kind of role they tend to gravitate to in a team can be quite telling.
Yeah, even if I think back to my own experience, suddenly people are ringing a bell. And well, what I found was that I would tend to clash with people who had different communication preferences to me. I'm not sure if you've ever done the HBDI thing with like the red, green, blue, whatever. So I'm like very blue, logical, whatever, low red, emotional. I would clash with people who are very high red, low blue. And I'd have conversations with him where I felt like you're just throwing a lot of words at me. I can't really get a handle on what you're saying. Can we just simplify this down to like just do X then Y? And they probably looked at me like, just don't you know what I'm saying? Like this is very simple to understand. I just need you to do something. And so it's a great clash. And so yeah, those interview questions must highlight some of those.
It's not necessarily showing there's a right or a wrong, but it's certainly a test to say, okay, well, would I be able to get on with them? Are we likely to? The importance of being willing to teach and educate folks in your team, coming into your team, and to look at more than one channel of ways of getting folks into your team. So those are people ready for a lateral move. Do I take someone that's been an apprentice? Do I take someone that's career shifting? Do I take someone out of academia? Do I take a new grad? As the key to getting a strong team and to getting the folks that are keen on learning, and they'll keep their skills current and find that exciting. So, and then the key to retaining those people, of course, is giving them plenty of opportunities to keep their skills sharp.
It sounds easy, but maybe challenging in practice.
Yep, always hard. Cool. All right. Well, thanks very much for having us on, Tim.
My pleasure. Thank you, Julian.